The concrete floor of the receiving dock vibrated slightly under the massive weight of the incoming freight trucks. The air tasted of diesel exhaust and the sharp, salt-heavy wind blowing off the coastal cliff view just beyond the heavy steel warehouse gates. I checked the manifest on my ruggedized tablet, scrolling through the endless alphanumeric data streams. 2 missing pallets. My jaw tightened. In this place, missing freight never meant it simply vanished. It meant someone was playing a shell game with the schedule, and I despised when the math of my terminal was manipulated. Elias. I called out to my foreman over the mechanical roar of a forklift reversing out of Bay 6. Dock 4. The bill of lading from the overseas textile shipment doesn't match the physical count. Isolate the load until I verify the chain of custody. Do not let that carrier leave the gate. Copy that, Marcus! Elias yelled back, waving a heavy leather-gloved hand and immediately walking over to secure the bay doors, locking the perimeter. I didn't like loose ends. I liked strict schedules, predictable transit routes, and physical items arriving exactly when and where I dictated. My job, as the regional supply chain director, was to create unyielding order out of the highly chaotic, unpredictable global movement of goods. A sharp, strained voice cut through the ambient industrial noise. Excuse me. Someone needs to tell me exactly where my inventory is. I turned. A woman was standing just inside the yellow safety line of the loading bay. She was wearing a tailored wool coat that looked entirely out of place among the high-visibility vests, hard hats, and steel-toed boots of my crew. Her dark hair was windblown from the coastal gusts outside, strands clinging to her cheek. She was holding a stack of crumpled shipping invoices in a white-knuckled grip, her posture rigid with an overwhelming level of stress. I walked over to her, keeping my pace steady, non-threatening, and deliberate. You're past the visitor checkpoint, ma'am. This is an active, heavy machinery zone. Please step back behind the yellow line. She didn't retreat. She planted her feet clad in impractical leather boots against the concrete. I'm Juliet, and those winter coats are mine. I've been tracking them for 3 exhausting weeks. Your terminal's automated system says they hit Dock 4 yesterday afternoon, but my racks downtown are completely empty. I looked at her. Her respiration was elevated. Her eyes were bright with a volatile mix of exhaustion, frustration, and genuine panic. She wasn't just annoyed by a routine delay. She was backed into a corner and fighting for air. I am currently auditing Dock 4, I said, my voice dropping into the calm, measured baseline tone I utilized to de-escalate stressed dispatchers and angry drivers. Step behind the line, Juliet, and I will cross-reference your tracking number. Juliet exhaled a shaky breath and took 1 step backward, complying with the safety boundary. She handed me the top invoice. The paper was trembling slightly in her grasp. I scanned the barcode with my tablet. The scanner beeped a sharp, digital confirmation that cut through the wind, and the data populated instantly on my screen. I recognized the vendor's name immediately. Trent Logistics. Trent was a third-party broker, notorious in the region for manipulating freight classifications to squeeze independent retailers. The system logged the container's arrival at the port, I explained, turning the tablet so she could see the tracking interface. But it hasn't cleared my internal intake scan. It means the container is physically here on the yard, but your specific pallets haven't been staged for local delivery? When will they be? Juliet asked, her voice tight, the panic threatening to edge higher. Trent is demanding final payment by 5 o'clock on Friday, or he claims he has the legal right to seize the inventory and auction it off to cover storage fees. I can't pay him until I physically inspect the goods. If I don't have those coats on the floor by this weekend, I miss the peak seasonal sales window. I'll go under. My eyes caught the clause in microfont at the very bottom of her invoice. Storage fees begin 48 hours after port arrival. The timestamp was yesterday morning. Trent had started the meter before she ever had a chance to touch the boxes. Her knuckles went white around the edge of the invoice. That was the real math. He was bleeding her dry by utilizing a technicality. He routed this as low priority deferred instead of standard direct, I noted, pointing to a small, obscure routing code on the screen. That automatically kicks it to our overflow queue. He created the delay on purpose so the 4 8-hour clock would run out before we even opened the container to sort it. Juliet wrapped her arms around her torso, the coastal wind biting through the open bay doors, chilling the air. It doesn't matter if it's rigged. It's in the contract I signed. I need that shipment. I will locate it, I said. She looked up at me, surprised by the absolute, unwavering certainty in my voice. The port authority told me on the phone it could take a week to find a misfiled pallet in a yard this size. The port authority doesn't run this warehouse. I do. I pulled a spare high-visibility vest from a safety hook on the concrete wall and held it out to her. Put this on. We're going to walk the grid. The interior of the warehouse was a cavernous labyrinth of reinforced steel racking, stacked 5 tiers high with shrink-wrapped pallets. The smell of cardboard, settling dust, and cold concrete was pervasive. The automated guided vehicles hummed in the adjacent lanes, flashing amber warning lights. I led her strictly through the designated pedestrian walkway, my heavy boots echoing alongside the sharp, rhythmic click of her heels. Juliet walked beside me, the oversized, fluorescent yellow safety vest swamping her tailored coat, making her look smaller but no less determined. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her face falling as she read the screen. Trent. He says if the wire transfer isn't initiated by tomorrow morning, he's locking the container. He can't lock what he doesn't physically control, I replied, checking the alphanumeric aisle markers against the tablet's database. You fight logistics with a superior paper trail. Once it's scanned into our bay with timestamps, his storage claim loses oxygen. The terminal clock proves the delay was on his end, not yours. We reached Sector G, the overflow zone. The industrial lighting here was motion-activated, buzzing to life with a harsh hum as we crossed the threshold, illuminating deep rows of mismatched, quarantined, and delayed cargo. Stay here, I instructed, pointing to a safe spot near a massive structural support pillar out of the way of any machinery. I walked down the aisle, reading the barcode tags on the mixed freight, meticulously checking the routing codes on the yellow placards. It required absolute focus. Trent had intentionally misclassified the freight code to bury it deep in the system. I checked my watch. We had less than 24 hours before his deadline. 12 minutes later, on the third tier, tucked entirely behind a massive shipment of heavy industrial auto parts, I spotted the distinct profile. 2 pallets wrapped in opaque black plastic, bearing the faded, specific label of her overseas manufacturer. I pulled my heavy-duty radio from my belt. Elias, Sector G, Aisle 14. Bring the reach truck. I found the missing textile pallets. And pull the forklift operator logs for the last 24 hours. I want to know exactly whose ID badge scanned this freight into the wrong zone. We are locking Trent Logistics out of our automated system. I walked back to Juliet. She was watching me, her posture tense, her hands buried deep in her coat pockets. I found them, I told her. Elias is bringing them down now. They will be on your loading dock in 2 hours. I'm pulling the digital transfer logs immediately. You will have undeniable proof that the delay was a vendor-side routing error, not a port issue. Trent cannot legally enforce his late fees. Juliet stared at me. The sheer panic that had been radiating from her slowly began to recede, replaced by a profound, sudden wave of relief. She closed her eyes for a second, a small, shaky exhale escaping her lips, visible in the cool warehouse air. Thank you, she whispered, opening her eyes to look at me. You didn't have to drop everything to do that. Safety and efficiency dictate that freight moves to its proper destination, I replied, keeping my tone professional, though the sight of her shoulders finally relaxing caused a strange, uncalculated tight sensation in my own chest. The system is functioning. Well, Juliet said, a genuine, albeit tired, smile appearing on her face. I escorted her back safely to the visitor checkpoint. I watched her walk to her car, noting that her steps were noticeably lighter than when she had arrived. I pulled the physical notebook I kept in my chest pocket and wrote her name down, along with the tracking numbers, not the digital tablet. I liked having the critical data written down in ink. 2 days later, I was standing in the back room of Juliet's boutique. I hadn't planned to be there, but a heavy, aggressive cold front was moving in off the coast, bringing a brutal mix of freezing rain, sleet, and high winds that threatened the local grid. I had stopped by under the guise of delivering the printed, certified copy of the terminal transfer logs, the physical, hard copy proof she needed to shut Trent down completely. The boutique was wonderfully warm, smelling of cedarwood, lavender, and crisp new fabric. The contrast to the industrial, concrete cold of my warehouse was stark. Juliet was at a large, smooth cutting table, sorting through the newly delivered winter coats. Her store manager, Sarah, was efficiently logging the new inventory on a laptop. "These logs are perfect, Marcus," Juliet said, tracing a finger over the official, raised terminal stamp on the paperwork. "Trent called an hour ago, threatening the auction again. I read him the exact timestamp of the port arrival and his own misrouting code. He got very quiet and hung up. He relied on your lack of visibility into the supply chain," I said, standing near the door, my hands clasped loosely behind my back. "When you proved you had the hard data," his leverage collapsed entirely. Before she could reply, the heavy glass front door of the boutique banged open. The wind howled through the shop, knocking over a heavy brass display stand with a loud, chaotic crash. Trent stood in the doorway. He was a man who wore too much cologne and a gray suit that didn't fit properly across the shoulders. He looked furious, his face red with the cold and anger. "A terminal stamp doesn't void my contract, Juliet?" Trent snapped, ignoring Sarah, who had immediately stepped back defensively. He marched directly toward the back room. "You still owe the final balance, plus the standard processing fee. If you don't wire it by close of business today, I'm pulling the freight back." Juliet stiffened, the certified paperwork crinkling in her hand. She hated confrontation. She hated the unpredictable chaos he brought into her carefully curated, safe space. I didn't move aggressively. I simply unclasped my hands and took 2 long, measured steps forward, placing my body squarely in the narrow doorway between the shop floor and the back stockroom. I blocked his path entirely. "You will not enter this stockroom," I stated. My voice was low, entirely devoid of emotion or hesitation. Trent stopped, startled by my sudden presence. He looked at my heavy work boots, my fire-resistant jacket, and the absolute, unyielding stillness of my posture. "Who the hell are you?" "I am the logistics director for the terminal that processed this freight. I generated the logs Juliet holds." I looked at him, dissecting his bluff with clinical precision. "I'm required to report misclassification to the Port Compliance Office. The audit triggers automatically once I attach the scan logs. You intentionally miscoded the bill of lading to trigger a delay clause. Walk away, Trent." Trent's face flushed a deeper red. "You're bluffing. You won't risk a terminal audit for one little boutique?" "I thrive on audits," I replied calmly, not breaking eye contact. "My records are perfect. Yours are not. If you pursue these illegal fees, I hit send on the compliance report." Trent looked past me to Juliet, searching for a weak point, but I shifted my weight, cutting off his line of sight again. He had no leverage, no physical access, and absolutely no legal standing. He scowled, turned sharply, and shoved his way out the front door, slamming it behind him. The boutique fell silent, save for the heavy rattle of the wind against the front display windows. The heavy brass display stand Trent had knocked over lay on the hardwood floor, a chaotic disruption to the room's symmetry. I walked over, gripped the weighted base, and righted it in one smooth motion. I aligned it perfectly with the edge of the front rug. I noticed a loose tension screw on the base hinge. I pulled a Leatherman multi-tool from my pocket, locked the flathead blade, and tightened it securely. Order restored. "He's gone," I said, folding the tool and turning back to Juliet. Sarah let out a low, appreciative whistle. "Well, that's one way to handle vendor management." She grabbed a stack of wooden hangers. "I'm going to start prepping the front racks." She quickly exited the back room, giving us space. Juliet set the paperwork down on the table. She looked at me, her dark eyes wide with a mix of shock and respect. "You just threatened a federal investigation." It wasn't a threat. It was a stated consequence of his intended action. I adjusted the collar of my jacket, suddenly feeling too warm in the small, fragrant room. "You didn't even raise your voice. Noise is inefficient." I looked around the stockroom. It was meticulously organized. Inventory bins were labeled cleanly. The fabric was categorized by size and color palette. She created order in her environment, just as I did in mine. "You build a good system here." Juliet smiled, a soft, genuine expression that lit up her features. "It took a long time to get it right." She walked over to a small kitchenette set up in the corner of the room. "Can I make you a coffee?" You drove all the way into town in this terrible weather just to hand me a piece of paper. The physical copy ensures there are no digital disputes, I justified. Though the undeniable truth was, I had driven into town because I wanted to verify she was safe. Black coffee is acceptable. I stood near the cutting table while she brewed the coffee. I noticed a slight tremor in her hands as she poured the hot water from the kettle. The adrenaline from Trent's intrusion was fading, leaving behind the exhaustion of the week's sustained stress. You need a better vendor, I noted, watching her. I know, but finding a reliable broker who handles small-batch overseas shipping without gouging is incredibly difficult. She turned and handed me a warm ceramic mug. I took it, being extremely careful not to brush her fingers. The heat seeped into my palm. I will compile a list of vetted, bonded brokers from my terminal network. I will filter them by reliability, route efficiency, and tariff compliance. She stopped and stared at me. Marcus, you have a massive warehouse to run. You can't fix my entire supply chain. I fix broken systems, I said, taking a slow sip of the coffee. The storm intensified significantly by Friday afternoon. The terminal was operating at reduced capacity due to the high winds. I had spent the morning outdoors, securing loose freight and verifying the heavy steel tie-downs on the exterior shipping containers. The rain was sideways and freezing. My phone rang in my waterproof pocket. It was Juliet. Marcus, she said, her voice strained over the loud sound of heavy rain hitting a roof on her end of the line. I'm sorry to call you at work, but I have a problem. Identify the problem. I pulled up my advanced weather tracking app on my secondary terminal monitor, instantly evaluating the threat level along the coastal sectors. I'm at the old family farm outside of town. I came out here to check on my grandmother's house before the storm got worse, but the creek crested and the access road flooded behind me. I can't get my sedan out. Are you in immediate physical danger? No. The house is on high ground, but the power just went out, and the temperature is dropping rapidly. I don't have any firewood inside. Stay in the house, I commanded, already grabbing my keys and walking rapidly toward my heavy-duty truck. You don't have to drive out here in this. I'll be fine until morning. You do not have a heat source. I am en route. I ended the call. I didn't panic. I planned. I grabbed heavy thermal emergency blankets, a high-lumen battery-powered lantern, and a large steel thermos of boiling water from the break room. The drive was a slow, calculated crawl through sideways rain and coastal debris. When I reached the access road, a foot of muddy, fast-moving water rushed over the asphalt. A standard vehicle would stall out instantly, but the heavy suspension of my truck breached the floodwaters without hesitation. I pulled up to the old farmhouse. It was entirely dark, the silhouette barely visible against the gray sky. I grabbed the supplies, stepped out into the freezing rain, and walked to the porch. Before I could knock, the heavy wooden door opened. Juliet stood there, shivering violently despite the thick wool sweater she wore. When she saw me, the rigid tension in her face broke entirely. You actually came, she breathed, stepping back to let me in. I stated my intention to arrive. I executed the route. I stepped inside, out of the wind, and pushed the heavy door shut, engaging the deadbolt to secure the perimeter. The house was bitterly cold, the air holding a damp chill. I set the supplies on a sturdy wooden table. I clicked on the lantern, casting a steady, warm circle of light. Before I addressed the cold, my instincts kicked in. I walked the perimeter of the main room, checking the window latches. The storm was battering the east-facing wall, but the seals held firm. The structure was secure. Sit, I instructed, pointing to a heavy armchair near the cold fireplace. She sat down, pulling her knees up to her chest. I unfolded a thermal blanket and draped it around her shoulders, tucking the edges in to trap her core body heat. I didn't linger. I stepped back instantly, respecting her personal space. Where is the woodpile? I asked. Out back, under the lean-to. But the tarp blew off. It's soaked. I will assess. I grabbed my flashlight and went back out into the storm. The top layer was wet, but I understood stacking mechanics. I dug down, extracting the dry, seasoned oak protected by the mass above it. I carried 3 heavy armfuls into the house. I arranged the kindling with precise geometry to maximize airflow and struck a match. Within 3 minutes, a steady, crackling fire was throwing heat into the cold room. I walked to the east-facing window, where a loose sash rattled violently. I used my pocket knife to wedge a folded piece of heavy cardboard into the gap, sealing the draft. Order restored. I turned around. The contrast between the freezing air outside and the radiant heat created a microclimate in the center of the room. Juliet was watching me from the armchair. "I am prepared," I said, pulling the thermos of hot water from my bag and pouring it into a clean mug. "Drink this. It will elevate your core temperature." I handed her the mug. This time, our fingers brushed. Her skin was freezing. I stepped back, suppressing the immediate, irrational urge to close the distance and shield her from the cold entirely. That was not the objective. The objective was to stabilize the environment. I watched her take a sip. Her shoulders stopped shaking. The mug steadied in her hands. The deep panic in her eyes dissolved into the steady, reliable warmth of the room. I walked to the other side of the hearth and sat down on the raised stone edge, keeping a designated safe distance between us. The silence in the room stretched, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the howling wind. It wasn't the tense silence of the warehouse. It was a shared, quiet sanctuary. "You don't talk much about yourself," Juliet said, staring into the flames. "You just show up, fix the disaster, and retreat. There is little data of interest to report." "I find that hard to believe." She looked at me, tilting her head. "Why do you care so much about order, Marcus? Why does every single thing have to be perfectly logged and secured?" I looked at the fire. I didn't like abstract conversations. I liked facts. But sitting here in the quiet, the simple facts felt insufficient. "Because chaos causes damage?" I answered, my voice lower than usual. My father was not a meticulous man. He lived his life in a state of constant, unpredictable crisis. He missed payments, broke promises, and lost our home because he refused to plan. I learned early that the only way to protect the things you value is to secure them. To build a system that does not fail. Juliet softened. She didn't offer a hollow platitude. She just understood the weight of it. "And your system works. Usually." I looked at her, sitting in the chair, safe from the storm. "But a system is only designed to manage freight and logic. It is entirely unequipped to manage." I stopped. I was losing the structured parameters of the conversation. "Manage what?" she whispered. I tightened my jaw. I forced myself to look away from her, focusing on a loose stone on the hearth. I took a slow breath, locking down the dangerous, uncalculated variables in my mind. Unpredictable elements, like driving into a storm zone without a secondary extraction plan. She didn't push. She recognized the boundary I had just erected to protect my own equilibrium. "Well," Juliet said gently, a warm undertone in her voice. "For an unpredictable element, I'm very glad you're here." I nodded once, remaining on my side of the fire. I spent the rest of the night monitoring the flames, ensuring the ambient temperature never dropped below 65 degrees. By morning, the storm had passed. The floodwaters receded. I drove my truck back to the terminal. The crisis was averted. The environment was secure. But as I walked back onto my loading dock, for the first time in my life, the perfect, predictable order of my warehouse felt entirely empty. The following Wednesday was the annual Coastal Business Association Gala. It was a formal event held at the Grand Hotel downtown. Juliet had invited me as a professional courtesy, a thank you for stabilizing her supply chain. I had accepted because my vetted list of brokers was complete, and I needed to deliver the data securely in person. The ballroom was a sea of calculated optics and expensive tailoring. It was crowded, filled with the loud, chaotic hum of networking and a live string quartet. I stood near the perimeter, wearing a dark suit, observing the flow of the room, tracking the exits and crowd density out of habit. Juliet was across the floor, speaking with two other boutique owners. She stood under the chandelier like she owned the room, shoulders back, voice steady. She was explaining a seasonal forecasting model, her hands moving with quiet, undeniable confidence. She wasn't the panicked woman on my loading dock anymore. She was the director of her own system. I watched Trent approach her from the bar. My muscles tensed. My instinct to step in and protect her instantly engaged. But I stopped. I held my position. Juliet didn't shrink back when he approached. She didn't look around for an exit. She stood her ground, She didn't raise her voice. I watched her pull a sleek, professional business card from her clutch and hand it to Trent with the absolute authority of someone who owned her domain. She spoke 2 short sentences, her posture unyielding. Trent looked at the card, his face falling in real time, and he walked away, thoroughly defeated. She had handled it herself. She didn't need me to block his path. A heavy, cold realization settled in my chest, dropping my internal temperature. The crisis was over. She had a secure vendor network now. Her inventory was safe. My function as the fixer was obsolete. I pulled the heavy manila folder containing the list of vetted brokers from my inside suit pocket. I walked over to the coat check area. I would leave the folder with the attendant for her, and I would return to the terminal. That was the efficient, logical conclusion to this arrangement. The contract was fulfilled. "You're retreating again." I turned. Juliet was standing a few feet away. She wasn't holding a drink. She was holding a newly signed vendor contract. The ambient light of the ballroom caught the quiet intensity in her eyes. "I am not retreating," I stated, maintaining my flat, controlled tone. "I am executing a departure plan. Your operational hazards have been neutralized. You handled Trent efficiently. I told him my new logistics partner handles all vendor negotiations, and he could forward his complaints directly to your office," she said, a faint, victorious smile playing on her lips. "I am not a partner. No." "You're not. Not yet." She walked closer, stopping just outside my immediate personal space. She looked at the heavy folder in my hand. "Are those the vetted brokers?" "Yes." 16 bonded agencies, ranked by reliability, transit times, and tariff compliance. I held the folder out to her. She didn't take it. She held up her newly signed contract instead. "I had a terrible blind date a few weeks ago," Juliet said quietly, her voice dropping underneath the noise of the gala. "Meant only for me. The guy spent an hour talking about how he wanted a woman who didn't need anything from him. He wanted something easy, uncomplicated." I kept the folder extended, my arm rigid. A logical preference for a casual relationship. "I don't want casual," she whispered. She stepped closer, intentionally breaching the invisible boundary I had maintained since the farmhouse. I whispered to my friend later that night, "Make me stop replaying that night. Make me stop trying to figure out why no one ever just shows up and handles things." She looked up at me, her eyes completely unguarded, laying her own facts on the table. Then I went to my warehouse the next day, and a man in a high-vis vest found my missing pallets, stood between me and a bully, fixed my drafty window, and drove through a flood to build me a fire. My chest locked. The calculated, highly structured world I lived in was rapidly dissolving, replaced by a terrifying, absolute clarity. "I don't want someone who just talks, Marcus. I want the sanctuary." She reached out, but she didn't take the folder. She placed her hand lightly on my forearm, right above my wrist. I didn't step back. I didn't retreat. I looked at the woman who had walked into my chaotic warehouse and demanded order. I dropped the folder onto a nearby table. The paperwork didn't matter anymore. I brought my hand up and covered hers, pressing it firmly against my arm, locking it in place. "You won't have to handle this alone again," I said. The words a concrete vow, heavy and absolute. I didn't make a scene. I just shifted my stance, offering her my arm, presenting a united, unbreakable front to the rest of the room. "If you want to go, I can get you out of this noise," I told her, my voice low and steady, finalizing the only plan that mattered. Juliet slipped her arm through mine, her tension completely gone, trusting the plan entirely. Just then, Sarah, her manager, walked past us, holding 2 champagne flutes. She paused, looking at my arm firmly linked with Juliet's, and then down at the signed vendor contract in Juliet's other hand. Sarah grinned. "I'll handle the rest of the networking tonight, boss." The logistics looked completely secure. Juliet laughed, a bright, clear sound. She looked up at me. "Lead the way." As we walked out into the cool evening air, she stopped, reaching into her clutch. She pulled out a small travel thermos and handed it to me. "Black coffee. No sugar. Acceptable?" I took the thermos, the warmth seeping into my palm, exactly like it had on the loading dock. I looked at her. The chaos of the world finally quieted. Accepted. Tomorrow, we'd put her new broker on retainer and my calendar on her desk. The end. Closing thoughts. I learned that true safety isn't about avoiding the storm, it's about building a shelter strong enough to withstand it. Real love isn't chaotic passion that leaves you exhausted. It's finding the person who brings order, shows up consistently, and makes you feel entirely secure. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.